All right. Hello, everyone. I am going to attempt to take you on a whistle stop tour of Search for My Tongue and give you some ideas in relation to a general overview of the poem and then some analysis as well. Hopefully, you'll be able to use this as a little revision tool. So, on the page, you can see what I've done is just collect a few paragraphs from off the internet that essentially tell you what's happening in the poem, and you can read through that in your own time. Down here are some pictures, screenshots of an annotated copy of the poem. I'll read you through the poem now, and then I'll take you through my annotations, and hopefully by the end of it, you'll have a good sort of understanding of the poem. You'll be able to return to this and refresh your memory as you get closer to the exams. So it's called Search for My Tongue, and it's by a poet called Sujata Bhatt. And if you read these up here, essentially, the situation that the speaker finds themselves in is that they have left their country of origin, India, and they've found themselves in some foreign country where they're essentially in a situation where they have to speak in a foreign tongue, a different language, because they're unable to use their mother tongue, which in this instance is Gujarati, I think. And so it starts with that scenario. And so the speaker finds themselves in this alien, foreign environment, and they're feeling despair, anger, frustration at the idea that they're losing their mother tongue, that their mother tongue, they feel, as you can see in around about line 13, is rotting and dying because they're not using it. And so they're in this dilemma, and they're worried and angry about the fact that they feel that they've lost their mother tongue, and through that, their connection to their sort of cultural heritage. However, towards the end of the poem, in this final stanza, it ends on a more sort of optimistic note for the speaker as she grows to realize that, in fact, this mother tongue of hers is inexplicably bound to them, that they're deeply connected to it. And regardless of what situation they may find themselves in, it is this organic, innate part of them. And you can see at the end, the idea is that this mother tongue grows back, pushes the other foreign tongue aside, and blossoms out of the speaker's mouth in this really lovely, beautiful celebration of her cultural heritage and language. So let's have a read of the poem. Search my tongue. You ask me what I mean by saying I have lost my tongue. Well, I ask you, what would you do if you had two tongues in your mouth and lost the first one, the mother tongue, and could not really know the other, the foreign tongue? You cannot use them both together, even if you thought that way. And if you lived in a place you had to speak a foreign tongue, your mother tongue would rot and die in your mouth until you had to spit it out. I thought I spit it out, but overnight, while I dream, and then it moves through this section that is in Gujarati to the final stanza, which is just a translation of this second stanza that's in Gujarati. It grows back. A stump of a shoot grows longer, grows moist, grows strong veins. It ties the other tongue in knots. The bud opens in my mouth. It pushes the other tongue aside. Every time I think I've forgotten, I think I've lost the mother tongue, it blossoms out of my mouth. Right, I'll take you through my annotations now, hopefully give you a sense of the poem. The title is Search for My Tongue. And there's a couple of things I'd say about the title. Firstly, obviously, if you're searching for something, it implies that, firstly, you've lost something, but secondly, most importantly, that you want to find it. There's a desire to find it. So it's not that this is a poem about someone who's abandoned their mother tongue and is okay with that, and it's that there's this sort of idea that they want to find it. The tongue in the poem obviously refers to her mother tongue, her Gujarati language, but is used, I guess, as a figurative, metaphorical representation of the speaker's cultural heritage, her sort of Indian Gujarati heritage. And I think language is sort of closely bound up with that idea of who you are and your identity and where you come from. It starts with quite a confrontational style, really. You asked me what I mean by saying I've lost my tongue. So initially, what's established is the idea that the speaker is misunderstood. She's having to clarify something. She's having to explain what she means. So the idea that she's perhaps culturally isolated is immediately introduced to us as a reader. I'm not really sure who she's speaking to. Relatively ambiguous. You sort of give that some thought for yourself, perhaps. It could be, I don't know, a family relative back in India that she's speaking to, who's sort of confused as to what she could mean. Like, what do you mean you've lost your Gujarati? And they're incredulous about it. Who knows? But it's worth giving some thought to. Anyway, it moves into lines 3 and 4, and you get this sort of growing sense of aggression almost and frustration when she's saying, I ask you, what would you do if you had two tongues in your mouth? So that repetition of the you, the personal pronoun, is quite confrontational and aggressive. It also introduces this idea of these conflicting cultures, the two tongues in her mouth. Metaphorically represent this idea of conflicting cultures, this foreign culture that she finds herself in, which I think is American, and the country that she feels she sort of comes from. And lost the first one, the mother tongue. So I think it's interesting, obviously, that we refer to your first language as your mother tongue. Obviously, the connotations of mother. I've written a few things down here, like where you come from, where is this idea of belonging. The concept of mother is obviously bound up with ideas of love, security, safety. And so that's what her cultural heritage sort of represents to her, I guess. And then she goes on to say, and you could not really know the other, the foreign tongue. I think this end stop here after other, moving through into this really sort of quite noticeably short line, the foreign tongue, lends the reading of it sort of this disdainful tone, like she says it, almost in disgust, the foreign tongue. And the short line, I think, sort of draws emphasis to that idea. She then goes on to say you could not use them both together, even if you thought that way, sort of that definitive statement. There's no way in which you can sort of use these tongues simultaneously together. There is a sense of conflict between them. And this sort of idea of sort of absolute sort of high modality, and if you lived in a place you had to speak a foreign tongue, there's no option there for her. There's no choice or autonomy. She's been forced into a situation where she's having to use this foreign tongue, and as a result, the conclusion that she draws is that the mother tongue would rot and die in your mouth. Now that's quite a disturbing image. It's certainly a powerful one, and the vocab helps to sort of establish it. You get the repetition of rot, which really lends power and emphasis to it. And the fact that that's split across two lines, I think, is also significant. And then obviously the idea of the tongue representative of a cultural heritage dying is quite an emotive idea. So quite powerful emotions on display here. And you really get this sense of anger, despair, grief almost, that she feels that she's lost something that's integral to her, that defines who she is in her mind. However, we reach a hinge point of the poem where she says she thought she'd spat this tongue out, dismissed it, rejected it, lost it. But, and that's sort of the key word, isn't it, that introduces a shift, a movement. Overnight while I dream. I've written down here that maybe it's significant that it happens overnight because obviously this is perhaps in her subconscious, the tongue growing back in her mouth, realizing she's still connected to it. It seems almost involuntary. It's sort of this natural, instinctive part of who she is. Then we move into this huge section, the second stanza that's in Gujarati. A couple of ideas about that. Obviously, the speaker at the start is culturally isolated. She's misunderstood. And perhaps by writing this stanza in Gujarati, she's placing the reader in a similar position to her. We can't obviously understand it, so we're isolated too. And maybe that encourages us to empathise with the situation that the speaker finds herself in, this foreign alien country where she can't use the language that she's used to, and as a result feels isolated. And so in a way, this stanza places us in the same position as the speaker. It's also perhaps significant that she's put this in the centre of the poem. it separates the two stanzas that are in English. Something you might be able to say about that as a sort of choice is that perhaps it recognises the idea that this Gujarati, her mother tongue, is an integral, central part of her. It's sort of embedded within her and who she is, so that the form of the poem reflects the scenario she finds herself in as this bilingual speaker that feels that she's, well, at the end of the poem, she recognises that it's a deeply rooted part of her. I also think, just in contrast to the English, the Gujarati seems vibrant and colourful. I don't know if that's just because it's different, but that, she gives it. We're given the phonetic spellings, and that just makes it seem like, I don't know, like in a sense, like lively and exciting. And so, in contrast to the sort of standard English, it seems slightly more interesting, perhaps. The final stanza of the poem is literally just a translation of the second stanza into English. So again, we're being placed in the position that the speaker finds themselves in, perhaps constantly having to translate between one language and another language. And it's capturing her circumstances. So there's obviously been a shift in tone here, and we move from the despair and the anger and the frustration to a realization that this mother tongue is very much a part of her still. So she describes how it grows back, and you can see the repetition of grows 4 times in those 2 lines, which I think obviously just highlights that the idea that this mother tongue of cultural heritage is powerful, dynamic. It's got this organic quality to it. It's almost like it's alive, pulsing within her. So it gives it strength. And there are a lot of active verbs in this final stanza, like the tongue ties, the bud opens, it pushes. So again, this idea that this mother tongue, cultural heritage, is strong. The conflict is resolved to the conflict that was introduced in the first stanza when she says, you can't use them both together, you've got 2 tongues in your mouth, is resolved here at the end, because the mother tongue ties the other tongue in knots. So we reach a resolution. One tongue triumphs over the other. So that's worth making a note of, I think. The other tongue is eventually pushed aside and forgotten. I think the repetition of thinks, I made a little note down here, because every time I think I've forgotten, I think I've lost a mother tongue. So obviously that reinforces the reality of the situation, that in fact she hasn't forgotten it, she hasn't lost it. The reality of it is that it's very much a part of her. So every time she thinks that she's forgotten this mother tongue, it blossoms out of her mouth. That's a really powerful image, a beautiful image really to close the poem with. The mother tongue is seen as vibrant, colourful, positive, obviously blossoms associated with renewal and growth, optimism and hope. And so it ends on this sort of note of celebration, I suppose, a really powerful closing image, and definitely one to remember if you get to write about this in the exam. I think it's interesting that she chooses lots of images connected with the natural world in that final stanza. Again, I think it goes back to this idea that the mother tongue is sort of like this natural, instinctive part of her. It's associated with her nature. So finally, the final stanza I've just written down here captures this sense of wonder and awe. It's a celebration of the mother tongue and the culture. And the conclusion that's reached is that culture, language stays with you. You're inextricably bound to it. So the conflict that is discussed and established at the start of the poem is ultimately resolved in her dilemma. She's free from this situation she finds herself in.